Hello, everybody. On behalf of the Center for Contemporary Culture of Barcelona, I'm so glad to be here in Kiev. I would like to thank the CANact Festival for inviting us. We would like to share with you some ideas about the urban fact. These are ideas which come up as lessons, as empirical lessons from everything we have learned at the CCCB after 20 years of running an award on public space. You have the exhibition here outside. But the first thing I would like to do, I was asked to define the idea of community. And I like this question very much because it helps us understanding what a city is. I think a city is just a kind of community. We had already communities before having cities, but we have reinvented the idea of community in the Neolithic times when we began to build cities. So, a city is a twofold community. I would like to share with you this idea, but first, let me go back to the roots of the word city. It has three main classical roots. Two of them come from Latin. Urbs, where urbanism or urban planning comes from, means the continent, the physical shape of the city, the space that we share. Then we have the word civitas, where city comes from, civilization, for example, which relates to the content of this physical shape. Okay, it's the population, it's the citizenship which inhabits this physical shape. But then we have the Greek root of the word, which is polis, where the word politics, for example, comes from. And this word relates to the way in which these two realities, the physical continent and the citizenship which inhabits it, relate to each other. So people living in a city can decide which is the shape of the city, of course, but the shape of the city itself determines how this citizenship relates with each other. Jangel puts it this way, in a sentence I like very much: as we shape the city shapes us. Every kind of physical organization of the city determines which are the relationships, the social interactions that we will have in this city. So, today I would like to state three main ideas. The first one is that every city in the world has always had two main threats. The second idea I would like to share with you is that there are four main tools in order to tackle those two threats. And the third idea is a painful paradox that puts a little contradiction of everything I will have told you before. Okay? So let's go for the first part. There are two threats in every city. As a city is a twofold community, by that I mean that there are two ways of experimenting this community. The first one is coexistence. We share the city with other contemporaries that are living with us in the same moment as we do. But the second kind of community is survival, meaning that the city is a shape that we have inherited from the past, from people who are already dead. There are more dead people than living people, okay? And they have taken lots of decisions on the urban shape that are already here and determine our way of living in the city. But also, there is not only those who have already died, but there are still those who are to come and who will inherit this city we are deciding on right now. So we have to think on them. The idea is that we share the city right now with others, but we transfer the city as a legacy to people we don't even know, but who are to come in the future, okay? So there are two main threats in this relationship of community and city. The first one is a threat to coexistence. The threats to coexistence are many. For example, the abuse of power, meaning corruption, real estate speculation, technocracy, top-down decisions which are taken against the interest of people and a large, etc., of course. Another threat to a coexistence would be the concentration of opportunities, meaning the concentration of wealth, of health, of access to education, to mobility, to affordable housing, or, for example, spatial segregation, big barriers that cut our urban fabrics and that avoid those who has less resources to participate on the common space of the city. Another example of threat to coexistence would be exclusion, like exclusion by gender, by origin, by status, by social status, of course, by age. Kids or elderly do not have the same rights to move around the city, for example, by disabilities, physical or mental disabilities, or even by sexual orientation. All these are examples of exclusions that we can find in the city. And let me be less abstract and more pragmatic and show you some examples by using the private vehicle as a mean. Cars are a threat to coexistence in our cities nowadays. We can deeply connect the idea of private car with the idea of death that we see in this cemetery. As we know, by means of scientific evidences already, car is causing great damage in public health in our cities, but it is also a very dangerous device which is putting in danger pedestrians and people who don't use cars. And also, it's a very unfair device which occupies a huge amount of public space in our cities and which disturbing other ways of moving, like, for example, public transport. And of course, in every city in the world, also in Kiev, I have already seen that, we can find huge amounts of housing which are facing highways, meaning that poor people, only poor people, are in this situation. Not rich people like to live in front of a highway. Also, the car industry has a huge visibility and is still, even if we have all these problems, they are still selling cars in our public spaces, like we see here in Barcelona, even in our bus stops, which should have to fight this private mobility system and be the competence of it. Also, the new cars that they want to sell us, for example, the self-driving cars, are a threat of abuse of power that can collect lots of data on us and which are already running algorithms that decide that the driver is more important than the pedestrian. Another threat to the community is a threat to survival. And some examples of it, it's the ecological dimension, of course. We have to speak about climate change, about the lack of the biodiversity, but also it's a threat because of the waste of natural resources, meaning water, energy, land, or even non-circular economy, extracting economy, which creates huge amounts of energy consumption or waste, for example. Also, financialization of economy is a threat to survival. Survival does not only relate to ecology, but also to economy. We can implement huge urban development and refurbishment with public money that will create huge amounts of public debt, which next generations will inherit. So the idea is that we should improve this legacy to next generations. And again, some examples using cars, as for example, all the gas emissions which provokes climate change in our cities. Also the waste of public space that we are giving to new ways of private mobility as electric cars, which is supposedly clean, but at the end of the day provokes also huge amounts of pollution because our electric power is far away from being clean. Also, those vehicles create a lot of waste we have to deal with. And also they demand huge infrastructures which not only create gas emissions, which provoke climate change because concrete wastes a lot of energy and provokes huge emissions, but also create huge amounts of public debt, again. So, in front of those two threats, we have two main tools. One is affiliation. Affiliation meaning gathering with others, joining others, and trying to find collective solution among contemporary who are living here today in the city in order to tackle these issues, in order to decide together which is the best solution for them. Okay, this affiliation has place between contemporaries which are living here today in the city. The other idea is filiation. Filiation is belonging to a tradition of those who are already dead and have given us knowledge and have let us have progress. Humankind is the only animal species which begins its life from an advanced stage, as we have our parents and our grandparents that give us, inherit us all the knowledge they have collected. We can start from an advanced point and not from zero, from scratch, okay? But filiation also means taking care and thinking of those who are to come and who will inherit the city. So, again, by means of mobility, some examples of that. The shift that we should do in our cities, in our public spaces, and which is already taking place, is a shift that goes from the scheme on the left side towards the scheme on the right side. It's a scheme that before gave lots of privilege to private car and complicated the mobility of pedestrians and bikes. And now we have to move toward a scheme which gives priority to pedestrians, then to bikes, then to public transport, which is much more sustainable and much more democratic, and then complicate the mobility of cars. How does this translate in real images? Well, we have to open up space for pedestrians for sure, and to facilitate social interaction and active mobility, which is more healthy, more fair, and more sustainable. Then we have to do like in Copenhagen, where they have a bike lane, a wide bike lane in every street of the city. There are more people using bikes in Copenhagen than in the whole United States of America. And of course, we have to see public transport infrastructures as temples of architecture. They must be appealing, they must be sexy, people must will to use them. They have to be well connected with bike parkings and with pedestrian spaces. Of course, we have to banish cars from primordial public spaces as riverfronts, like we see here in Bordeaux, where the riverbank was used as an open-air car park, and it has become a public space mainly for pedestrians. We have also to get rid of cars in our squares. We are already doing so, and to give them to pedestrians again. This revolution is already happening, And we will see now some examples of this coming from the European Prize for Urban Public Space, which, as a lesson, gives us 4 ways, 4 tools of democratizing our public spaces in order to tackle with these threats we have been speaking about. The European Prize for Urban Public Space, it's an award that has been run by the Center for Contemporary Culture of Barcelona and 7 other European institutions since the year 2000, and which deals with very difficult words to define, like, for example, the word Europe. We don't know what is Europe, which are its boundaries, okay? There is the geographical Europe, there's the political European Union. Ask, for example, a British where Europe starts and begins. So it's a very complicated word, okay? As it is as well the word urban. We don't know what a city is today after a century of modern urban planning, which has completely dissolved the idea of the city, which was very concrete, very defined, and now everything, everywhere you have urban infrastructures in the sprawling city. And also, we have the word public, which is not a comfortable word. It is a word which is in crisis. It could be something belonging to authorities, but then we wouldn't take into account the common sense of activists and neighborhood associations who maybe can claim for improvements in their cities, even if they are not legal, as we will see right now. So the prize, instead of feeling uncomfortable with these 3 difficult words to define, feels very comfortable in problematizing these 3 words. In every concrete work I will show you, there is an attempt to define one of these 3 words, which is a lesson for us. But first, let me share with you the logo of the prize, which, as you see, has 4 arrows, which represent these 4 senses of the word democratization. We want, in this prize, to democratize our cities, okay? So the first arrow is an arrow that looks downwards, and which represents the idea of redistribution. What is redistribution? It's the contrary of a gated community that only lets rich people, wealthy people come in and participate of that urban space, and which rejects poor people entering this condominium. So let's see some examples of how to open up opportunities and redistribute opportunities to participate of public space to everybody. In Marseille, for example, there was the main historic harbor, the old harbor, which was completely occupied by cars and enclosed to those who own a ship, so to wealthy people. And a huge transformation was done by which the space was first get rid of cars and given to pedestrians. Everybody can walk here and see the water for the first time. And the private ships have been reorganized in a way so that lets people have a relationship with water. Now this harbor is a main civic place which shelters community activities for the first time. Another example of redistribution is in VODICE in Croatia, where an open market, an old market, has been refurbished, but respecting the main feature of being open without facades and having a cross ventilation instead of having air condition, which wastes energy. And it's a place which enriches public space because it gives little traders of the outskirts of the city sell their products to neighbors in an open way, which is the opposite what shopping malls in peripheries do. So an open marketplace should also be considered as a public space, which redistributes opportunities of earning their life to local producers. Another example of redistribution is in Zaanstad, in the Netherlands. where there was it's a village in the outskirts of Amsterdam, which had a main square with the church and the city council, and suddenly in the 70s, a huge infrastructure for cars, a big highway, crossed through this very main square of the little village, leaving the church on the one side and the city council on the other. So it was a barrier, a rundown space, which created a barrier between the two halves of the city. So a participatory process was held here in order to open up opportunities for everybody to participate of these infrastructures. Below these infrastructures, many civic uses were put in order to let everybody use it as a roof, as a civic roof, which before was a barrier and which now connects both halves of the city with different features. Another last example of redistribution is in Colombes, in the banlieue of Paris, in the outskirts, which is a place where you only find housing and not any cultural facilities or economic facilities, where people living here feels like they are not being taken into account in the French society. So here some activists have created some spaces where people can relate with food, for example. They can cultivate, learn how agriculture works, and learn about the production of food. So they get new skills, which help them finding a job, for example, afterwards. So it's a way of redistributing economy. Also, they can learn how to recycle construction waste in order to rebuild ecological buildings. So here they also get new skills. Another sense of democratizing the city is an arrow that looks forward, that looks for the future, and which we could name sustainability. It's the contrary of what we see in this picture from the subway in Barcelona, where you have an advertising of Volkswagen after the Dieselgate selling cars in a metro station, which is a public transport infrastructure. Let's see some examples of how we implement sustainability in public transformations. One is in Malmö in Sweden, where a subway station has been liberated from commercial advertisement, which has been replaced by new art interventions. In this case, a Colombian artist has placed 25 screens in every side of the subway station that project filmations from landscape from all over the world. So the metro station becomes a wagon train, which feels like if you are waiting for your train, you are already in a train that shows you beautiful landscapes from all around the world. So this art installation is improving the time of waiting of travelers and is making that more people want to use public transport in the city instead of using cars, for example. Another example of sustainability is in Frankfurt, in the outskirts, where there was a military airport by the US Army, which was abandoned. It was in a very natural landscape, but it has remained as a ruin. So the idea was to make something of this premise, but instead of demolishing it completely in order to recover the natural order and taking the rubbish and the problem to another place, what they have done is a poetical demolition of the place that leaves the material there, but which helps nature to reconquer the space again by breaking the different components of the infrastructure. And some parts of the airport have been let as they were to let people from Frankfurt have this rare experience of skating in the middle of nature. Now it's a meeting place, it's a gathering place, which has been recovered in a sustainable way because it doesn't create a problem somewhere else. Another example of that is in BEGUES, next to Barcelona. It's a landfill, a huge landfill, which has completely fulfilled a valley in a natural park near Barcelona metropolitan area with the waste, the solid waste that has been created for years and which has been thrown here. So this place has been refurbished, but instead of taking the rubbish to another place, of course this would mean a huge amount of energy waste. What they have made is to create a cover on the landfill and convert it into a park, a pedagogical park, where children from Barcelona go to learn how to deal with urban waste in an ecological way and not making the same mistakes as we have done for many years. So even if it looks like a natural spot, this is deeply urban because it's the city who has created this problem. The third sense of democratization of the city is an arrow that looks to the past, that looks backwards, and which we could call memory. The first two senses, redistribution and sustainability, are already quite known because progressive urban planning is already using them. Progressive urban planning wants to redistribute. It's the red arrow, okay, which wants to get opportunities for the basis of the social pyramid. And also the sustainability arrow, which is the green one, the ecological one, is already on every table of an urban planner. But the next two arrows are quite more new. The first one is memory, which means that we must stop doing what Le Corbusier was proposing for Paris, which is tabula rasa, okay? Which is forgetting how the city was and proposing a new, completely new shape of the city and completely erasing the legacy that those who are not here anymore have given us. So instead of doing what Le Corbusier did or proposed to do, we have to recycle the pre-existence, give them new uses and new senses without trying to erase them. Some examples of that. In the European city, there are many presences which deal with memory, okay? Sometimes there are oblivions, like in KRAKOV. We had this square, the La Concorde Square, where the Nazis collected the Jews from the KRAKOV ghetto in order to take them to concentration camps. People was carrying their own furniture and clothes because they thought they would use them in the place they were going to, but suddenly before getting inside the trains, they were asked to leave their belongings in the square. So the square was full of things belonging to those people who disappeared. But the square didn't remember this memory. There was this huge oblivion. And so until the moment in which an art intervention was made in the square, and what they did was putting chairs and furniture in iron, remembering the absence of those who were killed by the Nazis. Another example of how to deal with memory, we find it in Berlin. The socialist authorities completely demolished the Schloss Palace, which was a Baroque palace where the Prussian emperors lived, because they considered it was a symbol of pan-Germanism. And they decided to create a modern box, the building you see here, which was the parliament of the Democratic Republic of Germany. But then, when the wall fell down, the new authorities of Germany decided that this building was a shame, was the symbol of a tyranny, and they wanted to completely demolish in order to rebuild completely the former Baroque Schloss Palace that was here. So the same mistake that the socialist authorities committed when they tried to completely demolish and erase the past in order to build a new building was again made by the democratic German authorities by demolishing this building. But meanwhile, a lot of money had to be collected in order to make this operation. So meanwhile, some activists showed the authorities how this building could be resignified with other uses, like big concerts or TV shows or naval battles inside the building in order to change its bad senses, but use it as a contemporary culture facility, which afterwards was completely demolished, and now the new Baroque palace is here. And another example on how to deal with memory is in Nantes, in France, which is a city that got huge amounts of wealth by trading with slaves, but there was no cultural facility, no museum remembering that memory. So what they did was to refurbish this riverbank space, which was, as you see, occupied by cars, and they transformed it into a river promenade, which had beneath a museum, which remembered the section of a slavery ship carrying people in this outrageous way. And recalling this section, they profited the section of the riverbank's pre-existing structure in order to host a new museum on slavery in all over the world. I will jump to the last arrow, which is participation, and which wants to avoid abuse of power, technocracy, top-down decisions, and open up discussion and knowledge of complex situations in order to let people decide on how do they want their city to be. It's the contrary of what we find many times in public spaces where people are not allowed to protest, for example, to express themselves. An example of that is in Bucharest, in Romania, where a street that is usually used as a car park, again, has completely changed in a summer by means of a project carried out by some young architects, which converted it into a swimming pool stage in order to let people use the street in another way. Kids were playing here all the day, there were concerts, and all the activities were organized by the neighbors. Another example is in Magdeburg, an empty plot where the city council promised to build up a municipal library, but the promise never came, so the neighbors decided to build it by themselves. First, they built a real-scale model with beer boxes. They decided the shape of their open-air library without roof, and finally they built it with the help of some young architects again, which is a garden that has the space to offer some books which has been given by the very neighbors, and where they can share those books with others instead of having them at home. And another example of participation and bottom-up definition of public space is in Madrid, in the Plaza del Sol, where the Indignados in the Indignados movement took the square for many weeks in order to claim for an improvement of democracy in Spain, but they reshaped the square as well by creating libraries, kitchens, and facilities for those who slept in the square while they were protesting. And of course, we couldn't not show the beautiful example of the Heavenly 100 Garden in Kiev, which was an empty plot which has been taken by citizens illegally, but with a very legitimate way, which democratizes this space and opens it up for everybody in the city. So, as you see, the arrow of bottom-up participation and the arrow of top-down distribution towards the basis of the social pyramid creates an axis which is affiliation, gathering with others, deciding together, and helping those who are in disadvantage in order to improve coexistence in the city. And in the same way, the arrow of memory and the arrow which looks towards the past and the arrow of sustainability which looks towards the future create an axis which is filiation, this sense of community that we have with other generations which are not here yet or which are not still here, and which is also a sense of community. And the last part is the painful paradox which takes us to acknowledge that everything that I have told you doesn't work anymore. It's not true, okay? Because all these improvements we have been looking at, all this improvement of public transport facilities, of squares, of riverfronts, have a big problem. They provoke the increase of housing around them, and they make that those citizens who should benefit from these urban improvements cannot profit from them anymore because they cannot afford the increase of housing prices and they have to quit the neighborhood. Also, these improvements of riverbanks, of public transport facilities, of squares, creates an attraction of tourism in our city centers, and this led also to the increase of housing prices or commercial premises. We are talking, of course, about the word gentrification. I guess you have it in Ukrainian as well. If you don't, you will have it very soon because it's coming everywhere. And it's a word we have to tackle it. Every time we want to improve public spaces, we have to think about housing. They are not different matters. They are the same. They are deeply connected. And this means that we must stop improving squares and streets and pedestrianizing and improving facilities, municipal facilities, public infrastructure, without thinking in the prices of real estate. At the same way that we have public spaces which have no roof, we must understand that part of our housing stocks must be public and affordable as well, in order to let this democratization of the city arrive to everybody and not just to the wealthier and to the private developers. So, thank you very much. Dia kuyum bam.